Europe just did something that could change the future of China's aviation dreams. After years of work, thousands of test hours, and a national push to prove it can stand beside Airbus and Boeing, China's C919 is finally flying passengers. Yet just as the jet begins stepping outside China's borders, Europe quietly steps forward with an announcement that stops everything in its tracks. The message could not be clearer. China's new jet will not be certified in Europe anytime soon. And this isn't a small delay. Europe's aviation regulator says the C919 needs another 3 to 6 years of review. That pushes any European approval from 2025 all the way to somewhere between 2028 and 2031. For China, that means millions of potential passengers, dozens of routes, and a whole section of the global market suddenly locked behind a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. So the question now is simple. If China's new jet is already flying daily routes and carrying thousands of passengers, why did Europe just stall it? Because at first glance, Europe's explanations sound straightforward. They say COMAC, the manufacturer, is new. They say they don't have enough validated data. They say the process takes time. But when you look closer, this delay arrives at the exact moment China's aviation industry is growing faster than ever, while Europe's largest aircraft maker, Airbus, is fighting to keep up with record demand. And it's happening while the United States is tightening export controls on the Western-made engines and avionics that power the C919. The timing alone raises questions. But before we break down Europe's decision, you need to see what China actually built. Because the C919 isn't just another jet competing for a slice of the market. It's the first real challenger to the Airbus A320neo and Boeing 737 MAX in decades. And for Europe, for the United States, and for the entire balance of global aviation, that makes this aircraft far more than a new plane in the sky. To understand why Europe drew a line here, we have to go back to the start, to what China set out to build, how long it took, and why this project matters far beyond airports or airlines. Because once you see the scale of this aircraft's impact, Europe's sudden hesitation starts to look very different. Now let's go to where it all began. When China launched the C919 program in 2008, the goal was simple on paper but massive in reality. Build a large commercial jet that could finally loosen Airbus and Boeing's grip on the world's most valuable aviation market. At the time, China was importing nearly every major airliner it flew. The country was growing fast, airports were expanding even faster, and by 2040 China was expected to become the largest aviation market on the planet. Yet every new plane that landed there came from Toulouse or Seattle. So Beijing made a decision. If China wanted to control its own aviation future, it needed more than airports. It needed its own aircraft builder. COMAC stepped in with the C919, a narrow-body jet meant to match the Airbus A320neo and the Boeing 737 MAX, same category, similar size, similar mission, the workhorse routes that make airlines money. But building a jet like this from scratch takes a level of engineering, testing, and supply chain discipline few countries have ever achieved. The early years were slow. By 2011, the designs were ready. By 2015, the first prototype rolled out in Shanghai. In 2017, the jet finally lifted off for its first flight. And from that moment forward, one thing became clear. China was serious. To push quality and reliability, COMAC used many Western systems. Not because China couldn't design its own, but because global certification demands proven equipment. The jet flies with GE and Safran's LEAP 1C engine. Honeywell supplies flight controls. Collins Aerospace provides navigation equipment. Parker, Moog, Liebherr, Michelin, many of the world's major suppliers are built into the C919 structure. For Europe and the US, this was a double-edged message. On one hand, China was willing to meet global standards. On the other hand, if the C919 entered the world market, Airbus and Boeing would face their first real competitor in 30 years, built partly with their own technology. The jet completed thousands of hours of test flights. It endured structural trials, wind tunnel work, high-altitude testing, and extreme climate runs. By September 2022, China's regulator finally certified the aircraft. 8 months later, in May 2023, China Eastern Airlines flew the first commercial passengers between Shanghai and Beijing. Now, the C919 flies daily, with multiple aircraft delivered and more on the way. China had done it. They had created a homegrown commercial jet that could stand beside Western models. And if everything went according to plan, the next step was simple: certification in Europe. But this is where the story changes. Because just as the C919 began expanding its routes, Europe stepped forward with a message China did not expect. And this is where the wall finally appears. For China, the next stage seemed like a formality. Europe and China had already signed the Busa Agreement back in 2019, which took effect in 2020. This deal was meant to streamline cooperation between regulators and create a pathway for European validation of Chinese aircraft. On paper, it was a major diplomatic step forward. In practice, it meant COMAC could bring the C919 to Europe by following EASA's certification process. So when China started commercial flights, began delivering the jet, and even expanded into cross-border service with daily Shanghai to Hong Kong routes, many assumed Europe would move ahead with its own review in 2025. It fit the timeline, it fit the agreement, and it fit China's messaging that the C919 was built to global standards. But then Europe spoke. In April 2025, EASA's executive director, Florian Guillemet, delivered an update that stunned the industry. He confirmed that the C919 would not be certified in 2025. Not next year, not soon. He announced that the aircraft needs another 3 to 6 years of analysis, pushing any potential approval into the window between 2028 and 2031. 6 years is a lifetime in commercial aviation. EASA didn't frame it as a delay. They framed it as necessary. They said COMAC is a new manufacturer with limited certification history. They said they need more validated test data. They said every major system needs to be examined with deeper scrutiny than usual, because Europe has never certified a Chinese-built narrow-body jet before. On paper, that sounds reasonable. But the announcement came at a moment that raised eyebrows everywhere. Airbus is struggling to meet record global demand. Boeing is fighting to recover from years of turbulence. And China is accelerating production of a jet designed to compete with both. The idea of a fast-track certification was already unlikely, but pushing it as far back as 2031 caught even seasoned analysts off guard. EASA insisted this timeline is technical, not political. Yet the message still landed with force. Europe isn't ready to open its market to China's challenger. Not now, and not for years. And for China, that wasn't the only concern. Because the C919's engine, avionics, and several critical systems come from Western suppliers. Any pressure on export controls, any shift in U.S. policy, any tightening in supply could create serious uncertainty for COMAC's future deliveries. Europe said this was all about safety. But to China, it looked like something else, a door that was supposed to be open, slowly swinging shut. And beneath that door is where the real pressure begins. On the surface, EASA's explanation sounds like procedure. A new manufacturer needs extra scrutiny. More data must be verified. Every system, every process, every test result has to be checked again through Europe's own lens. Aviation is built on caution, and no regulator wants to rush a decision that affects millions of passengers. But when you break down what's really happening behind the scenes, the picture becomes more layered. First, the technical side. COMAC is entering a world where Airbus and Boeing have decades of certification experience, dozens of aircraft programs, and established global maintenance networks. The C919 is China's first modern jet of this size. Europe has never certified something like it from China before. There is no long-standing track record to lean on. That alone makes EASA slower and more careful. Then there's the supply chain. The C919 is built with systems from Western companies, engines from GE and Safran, flight controls from Honeywell, avionics and communication systems from Collins, hydraulics from Parker, and more. These companies are trusted in Europe, but the way they integrate into the A-frame, the way COMAC handles them, and the way the aircraft behaves over thousands of hours of use are all new to EASA. Validating that combination takes time. There's also the issue of global support. Europe expects any aircraft flying in its skies to have a predictable maintenance and repair ecosystem. That means parts availability, trained engineers, certified workshops, and long-term support networks. COMAC is still building those, mostly inside China. Outside China, that infrastructure is still thin. And for EASA, that's a risk. All of this adds up. But then comes the part that creates real tension. The timing. China is pushing harder than ever to expand its aviation industry. Airbus is expanding production lines in Tianjin to meet huge Chinese demand. Boeing is still struggling to regain trust from the MAX crisis. And the C919 is not a niche aircraft. It aims to compete head-on in the single-aisle market, the most profitable segment in aviation. If the C919 reached Europe too quickly, it would enter the same competitive space Airbus relies on for its most important jets. And while EASA insists its decisions are purely technical, many analysts in China see this long timeline as strategic protection. keeping the European market closed long enough for Airbus to keep its dominance. There's no official proof of this, but the combination of technical needs, political timing, and market pressure creates a situation where even a normal certification process becomes a battlefield. And that pressure is only growing, because while Europe slows the C919, China is not standing still. In fact, it's already finding ways around the blockade. Europe may have put the brakes on the C919, but the jet itself hasn't slowed down. Inside China, it's flying more routes, more often, with more airlines placing orders. And for COMAC, this progress sends a clear message. If the Western door stays closed, they'll build their own path. The first big sign came at the end of 2024. China Eastern announced the C919 would operate daily flights between Shanghai, Pudong, and Hong Kong. On January 1st, 2025, that service officially launched. For the first time, the C919 crossed out of mainland China on a scheduled, daily international route. Thousands of passengers began flying on an aircraft that Europe still doesn't recognize. Shortly after, interest began emerging from places most people weren't watching. For China, that's a breakthrough. For Europe and the United States, it's a warning. But the biggest twist isn't who is accepting the C919 today. It's why they're doing it. Many of these countries want cheaper aircraft, faster delivery timelines, and alternatives to the Airbus, Boeing duopoly. And China is offering exactly that. While Europe takes 6 more years to review the C919, China isn't sitting still. COMAC is increasing production rates, expanding its service network, and pushing toward long-term independence by testing the CJ1000A, the indigenous engine designed to replace the Western-made LEAP-1C. If that engine succeeds in the future, China's national aircraft will rely less on American and European suppliers. And once that happens, the leverage behind export controls, certification delays, and geopolitical pressure begins to fade. Europe slowed the C919 from entering its skies, but it may have also accelerated something else. A world where China doesn't need Europe at all. Europe's decision didn't ground the C919. It simply slowed its entry into the world's biggest markets. But that pause has created a ripple effect no one fully expected. Countries that once waited for Europe's approval are now choosing China's regulator instead. And with each new airline that accepts the C919, the balance of who decides what is safe in global aviation shifts a little more. Europe says this timeline is procedure. China sees it as strategy. But both sides know the same thing. The C919 is only the beginning. COMAC is already working on larger jets. The CJ1000A engine is moving through tests. And if China solves the last bottleneck holding it back, the next aircraft won't need as many Western parts or Western permission. That's the real reason this stall matters. Not because Europe delayed a jet, but because China is already preparing what comes after it. And if Europe thinks the C919 is a challenge, wait until they see the project China plans to push next. The one that could hit them far harder and far sooner than anyone is ready for. That story is already unfolding.